Well, first I want to thank all of you for coming out here, and I especially want to thank the people whose work and efforts made this possible. Damon and Janet and Pam and Leslie Price, who unfortunately couldn't be with us here today. To give you an overview of what we're going to talk about this evening, I'm going to present a book published in 1908 called The Kybalion. We're going to talk about its author, William Walker Atkinson. We're going to see this book as a case study of the influence that metaphysical traditions have had in America, and see several of the direct connections that Atkinson and the Kybalion have to Theosophy. So I'm going to give you an introduction to the Kybalion. We're going to briefly go over the contents of the Kybalion, and then we're going to talk about the life of William Walker Atkinson leading up to the publication of the Kybalion. We're going to see how many of these influences manifested themselves in the text of the Kybalion. Then we're briefly going to look at the life of William Walker Atkinson after the Kybalion, and then what I think is the most interesting part, the life that the Kybalion takes on after the passing of William Walker Atkinson. We're going to address such themes as the questions of authorship of the Kybalion, verifying William Walker Atkinson's sole authorship of the Kybalion, why the Kybalion spread around the world in the way that it did, and its uses in various traditions in the last nearly 110 years. And then finally I'll have some concluding thoughts. As I was coming here, it really struck me what a homecoming it is to talk about the Kybalion here at the Theosophical Society. As we're going to see this evening, in my mind, it's very significant that it's being presented to a group of people here. I think it would be absolutely in line with William Walker Atkinson's wishes. So to begin, I always like to frame the Kybalion in big terms, and I want to talk about the American context of the Kybalion. My own mentor at UC Santa Barbara, Catherine Albanese, historian of religion in America, I think her biggest contribution throughout her long career was establishing this idea of an American metaphysical tradition. Previously, people looked at American religious history in basically two forms. A denominational history. How do we understand religion in America? It's what the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Baptists did in their own organizations. Other people looked at revivals and awakenings and said religion in America could be boiled down to religious enthusiasm and fervor and these kind of upswellings of Protestant evangelical sentiment. And what Catherine Albanese suggested was that there was actually a third stream, just as powerful and just as significant, and she called this American metaphysical religion. She said that this is a stream of religious thought and practice that extends back before the founding of America all the way to the present, and is just as significant and important as other ways in which people have looked at religion in America. She says that the American metaphysical tradition is defined by four main features: the mind and its powers, an idea of correspondence, as above, so below, microcosm and macrocosm. Third, she says that the American metaphysical tradition is defined by ideas of energy, universal forms of energy, be they prana or chi or mesmeric fluid. And finally, she says that American metaphysical religion is defined by ideas of healing and wholeness, salvation through spiritual growth and practical transformation. So the Kybalion, I see it as perhaps one of the most remarkable case studies of how the American metaphysical tradition works and operates. So what is the Kybalion? The Kybalion is a short book. It's often been described as a slim volume with 15 chapters and little over 200 pages. The core of the Kybalion are 7 Hermetic maxims that Atkinson, through the course of the Kybalion, unpacks and explains and gives practical examples of. Around these core teachings, Atkinson has created, I would say, a myth or an idea of where these ideas came from and why they're so significant. So he sees them as part of an ancient and secret Hermetic tradition that can be found throughout the world. These 7 Hermetic truths, as he describes them, are the principle of mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental. And from mentalism, we go to the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. And then we move to the principle of vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. And then that leads into the principle of polarity. Everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pairs of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. And then we move to the principle of rhythm. Everything flows in and out. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. The principle of cause and effect, that every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. And finally, the Kybalion offers the principle of gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. I think the best way to understand what the Kybalion is to understand the life of its author, William Walker Atkinson. We can see the various influences of his life being placed within the Kybalion. This is very much a self-reflective labor of love, in my opinion, from Atkinson. If Atkinson was destined to be anything in life, it was to be a grocer. His father and his father's father were both small business owners in Baltimore. Atkinson himself was born a few months after the opening of the American Civil War. And I believe his birth was not too far from the opening battles. He grew up in a very stable, prosperous, middle-class family. His life seemed very much set for him. And he often talked about in his writing, without letting on that how reflective it was of him, this cliched saying that was passed around America in the time of the person who neglected their dreams and neglected their ambitions. The morbid joke was that there was a gravestone that said, "Born a man, died a grocer." And I think that was very true for him. When he starts moving from his teenage years to his early 20s, Atkinson seems to have chafed at the idea of falling into this kind of simple life that was set up for him. In his early 20s, he seems to have suffered some sort of mental breakdown. He disappears from his hometown of Baltimore. He reappears in a hotel in Philadelphia, and he writes a series of letters to friends and family and various love interests, saying that he was determined to throw himself into the river and end his life. Clearly, he does not do that. But what seems to have happened not long after he comes back from Philadelphia to Baltimore is he discovers Theosophy. In letters that he writes later in his life, he talks about reading the book Esoteric Buddhism. And from the way that he describes his reading habits, he seems to place his own interests very much within the timeline of theosophical books and theosophical figures and when they are appearing and when they are writing. Atkinson had a very unusual and strained relationship to any kind of membership. Throughout his writings, it seems to be something very idiosyncratic in him that he didn't want to be a member of any group. And although there are no records of him being an official member of any TS Lodge, he is clearly, for at least 50 years of his life, he is actively engaged with theosophical writings. They show up in his own writings. The last manuscript that he writes is a primer on theosophy for other people to become engaged with theosophy. What I found fascinating in my research of Atkinson, one of the things that I tried to do was recreate his library shelves. So anytime that he would make a quote or make a reference, I would trace it back and see roughly what would his library shelf look like? What was he reading? Where was he getting his ideas from? And one of the big discoveries that I made was that all of the quotes that he has about science and scientific discoveries and technology, they're all traceable back to Theosophical periodicals. So even his view of the modern world and science and technology, he's getting through the lens of Theosophy. So in his early mid-20s, Atkinson seems to travel around relentlessly throughout the Northeast and the Midwest in search of not just a career, but a vocation, an identity, something that he can do, something that he can become on his own, outside of his family. And it seems that during this time he is engaged in different practices of physical culture and self-help. And this also seems to be the beginnings of his interest in ideas that he'll later embrace with New Thought. He's very much fascinated by the business world and office politics. Why does one person end up being so successful in sales and another person does not? How can two people enter an office building at the same time and one rises up to be vice president and the other stays at a clerk level? So he's fascinated with these ideas, and they play out, I think, when he fully embraces New Thought at the turn of the century. He does find his vocation, and it is with the law. This is him as an apprentice. Atkinson is on the left. The man on the right is J.S. Lysenring, who is an attorney in Pennsylvania. As was standard in the time, to become a lawyer, you studied under a senior attorney, and then you took the bar. This is what Atkinson does, and then he moves out on his own, and he is a very successful lawyer in Johnstown, Pennsylvania for several years. And then his old boss calls him back in, and this is clearly the promotion of a lifetime. His boss is looking to retire. He wants Atkinson to take his place. So Atkinson's life seems very much set. He will have his own law practice in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He'll be very successful and stable and prosperous, and at this time, he's married with a young son. Through a weird set of circumstances, Atkinson is denied his legal credentials in moving back from Johnstown, Pennsylvania to Altoona, Pennsylvania. So he has two options. He can either illegally practice law without a legitimate license, or he can retake the bar exam through the same people who denied his credentials and were seemingly set against him. So Atkinson seems to, at this point, have a second mental breakdown. He is living in Philadelphia, again, the same city, with his brother-in-law, and then he disappears for 6 weeks. And no one knows where he is, and no one knows what he's doing. By tracing back Atkinson's writings and various publications, I discovered that during that time, Atkinson was in Chicago. He is on the far right, if you can see him with the bow tie, and the man on the far left treating patients is Herbert Parkin. Parkin practiced what he referred to as suggestive therapeutics, kind of a light and mild form of medical hypnotism. Parkin's idea was that, similar to someone being in a hypnotic state, if someone was gently relaxed and was given suggestions or talked to, that this could affect significant healing and transformation. Atkinson, from various writings, seems to have been very taken with Parkin. He seems to have seen him as a man who had great power and who had great understanding into how the mind works. And so when Atkinson reappears in Philadelphia after a 6-week disappearance, almost immediately he moves his family to Chicago, and at nearly 40 years of age, he makes a radical shift in careers, and instead of continuing to practice the law, he becomes an author and a lecturer and a publisher, and he begins writing for New Thought magazines on various topics. Atkinson is extremely successful in this second career. He seems to be the darling of this magazine, and under his editorship, the magazine circulation just skyrockets and multiplies. So Atkinson begins to publish and lecture and write magazine articles and books. He also had a rather unusual when I interviewed Atkinson's granddaughter, she said that he and his wife loved to move. They loved to move from one house to another, from one city to another. It was just something they liked to do. They liked the change of scenery. One of the effects that this has is that Atkinson, throughout his 30-year career as a writer, ends up bouncing back and forth between primarily Chicago and Los Angeles. He spends a little time in New York. And what this does is this gives him ample opportunity to meet and encounter and develop relationships with a who's list of metaphysical America during this time. There's just an incredibly long list of figures that he works alongside, that he edits, that he writes for, that he lectures with side by side, that he's part of organizations with. One of the people that he is placed in touch with is this man, Premananda Baba Bharati, on the left, who is one of the first Hindu missionaries, and he's a Krishna devotee in the United States. And Bharati actually establishes the first Krishna temple in the United States in Los Angeles. The building on the right is Blanchard Hall, where Bharati and Atkinson share a stage several times. And Atkinson writes 2 articles for Bharati's magazine, The Light of India, and they seem, by all measures, to have a mutually admirable and mutually influential relationship. Atkinson takes on Bharati's ideas, Bharati adopts some of Atkinson's ideas, and after Atkinson moves back to Chicago in 1907, the 2 works that he immediately launches on are editions of Hindu sacred texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, that are explicitly designed for an American and a New Thought audience. And this is where we kind of pivot and we start to look at the influences of Atkinson's life from this point onto the Kybalion, and it starts to make more sense of the wording and the language and the design of the Kybalion. So from his works on Hindu texts that seem to be inspired by Bharati, some of this language appears in the Kybalion. So we see Atkinson making the choice in these editions to refer to God or the Absolute as the All, in many times in all capitals. And we see this again in the Kybalion, where the All is referred to by that phrase, the All. From his dealings in New Thought and suggestive therapeutics and medical hypnotism, we see the central importance he places on the mind also within the Kybalion. The first law is the law of mentalism. All is mind. And we see this here. This is Hermetics, but this is also the core of New Thought teachings. The universe and all it contains is a mental creation of the all. All is mind. And another influence that we see is his career as an attorney. I think in a very subtle level, one of the reasons why Atkinson's writings, particularly in the Kybalion, are so eloquent and persuasive is because this is what Atkinson did for many years. He was someone who could very deftly argue a point and make a case. I think it also is an influence for Atkinson's wanting to describe the universe in terms of universal laws. And he even will refer to the all as the law, and he sees the law and the all often as interchangeable. And finally, another influence that we see on the Kybalion is Atkinson's encounters with Theosophy. There is a lot of theosophical language in the Kybalion. He refers to the teachings of the Kybalion as a secret doctrine. He is also describing Hermetic wisdom as a kind of perennial philosophy. What was true for the Hermeticists is also true in India, and we see it in Chaldea and everywhere else. And something that I did not know, when I edited the definitive edition of the Kybalion, was it seems that if there was any model for the Kybalion, it was the work Light on the Path by Mabel Collins. One of Atkinson's earliest pieces of writing, and I think his first writing under the pseudonym Yogi Ramacharaka, was an introduction to the work Light on the Path. And I think this is the model that Atkinson takes on for the Kybalion. If we condense teachings into several maxims that are then explained and drawn out to the reader, that seems to be what he takes from Light on the Path and brings into the Kybalion. And also the idea that a text can in some ways have a mind of its own, and a text will be useful to a reader only when the reader is ready for it. He writes about that in his introduction to Light on the Path, and then he adapts that to his writings in the Kybalion. So after the Kybalion is published in 1908, Atkinson continues his life as a writer and an editor. He writes at an absolutely staggering pace. Through his various pseudonyms, it seems that he wrote approximately 100 full titles, and I would estimate somewhere around 700 to 800 magazine articles. In the 19-teens and 1920s, many of the magazines that are under Atkinson's editorial control are essentially entirely his creations. Advanced Thought magazine, which he edits in Chicago in the late 19-teens, many of the issues, when you understand who is behind the various pseudonyms, you realize that Atkinson is essentially writing every issue on his own. He moves back to Los Angeles in the early 1920s, and as he ages, his pace of writing and publication slows down. He continues to give lectures in addition to writing, and then he writes 2 manuscripts that did not see publication in his lifetime, and then he passes away in 1932 in Pasadena. And this, as far as I know, is the last taken photograph of Atkinson, right here. And so before we get into the life of the Kybalion itself, I want to make a little bit of a side journey and talk about the life that another set of writings that Atkinson did, the life that they took on. And I think, on one hand, this helps to explain what happens with the Kybalion. It gives us a parallel example. But I also think it adds to what a fascinating and remarkable character that Atkinson was, that he could have such a wide, diverse, and global influence, not just in one realm, but in several. So starting in 1903, Atkinson begins to write a series of books under the pseudonym Yogi Ramacharaka. And like all of his other works, the various influences on his life that we talked about play out in his books on yoga. He sees the yogi as an ideal type, in the same way that some people would refer to a gentleman or a true lady. That's how he imagines the yogi. So he uses the yogi as a kind of character to assign all of these teachings that he sees are important. He writes about 13 books on yoga under the pseudonym Yogi Ramacharaka. And the final is published around 1913. And then a remarkable series of events takes place. The Ramacharaka books are quickly translated into Russian, both in Riga, Latvia, and St. Petersburg. A little event known as the Soviet Revolution happens in 1917, which effectively shuts Russia out from further exposure to teachings on yoga. So for about 70 years, the books of Yogi Ramacharaka, their translations into Russian, are one of the main sources of information on yoga in the Soviet Union. The Ramacharaka books are also translated without attribution in Japanese, and they also take on a remarkable life. The ideas of prana are introduced to Japan. The term prana itself is introduced to Japan in the early 19 teens through the writings of Ramacharaka. They seem to be a strong influence on the practice of Reiki and the teachings of the man on the right, Nakamura Tenpu, who is perhaps one of the largest self-help figures in modern Japan. And in a fascinating irony, by the time Atkinson is in Los Angeles in the 1920s, there are a whole host of traveling yoga teachers from South Asia in the United States who are making a living going from city to city, giving lectures and holding private classes. And many of them use the teachings of Yogi Ramacharaka as their material to teach their classes. Something else that I think is fascinating is, just as in the Kybalion, Atkinson's love of Theosophy comes through in his works written as Yogi Ramacharaka. And so it is no surprise that Theosophists of his day will look at the Yogi Ramacharaka works and find a resonance. So I found advertisements of the Ramacharaka yoga techniques being taught by Theosophical groups in various parts of the country, and there was even a lodge in Durango, Mexico that was named after Yogi Ramacharaka. So bringing us to the Kybalion, how do we know who was the author of the Kybalion? This has, I think, been the blessing and the curse of the Kybalion. Misunderstandings and mysteries about its authorship have made it more attractive to readers, but at the same time they've obscured the source of many of its teachings. The pseudonym that Atkinson used for the Kybalion was Three Initiates, and many people have taken that to mean that there were three actual authors who were writing the book. As most of us who have done group projects together would know, the more people that you add to a project, often the more difficult and complicated it gets. And it would be hard to imagine three hands writing a text as consistent and elegant as the Kybalion. Another byproduct of this is that if you can imagine that there are three authors to the text, no one is really excluded from their own ideas of who is an author for the Kybalion. You can suggest that someone that you prefer was an author, one of the authors of this book, and there's still room for two others. So it's added a degree of flexibility for various claims about the Kybalion. So here are 9 of the people who have been put forth as being authors of the Kybalion, going kind of from top left to right. Paul Foster Case, Claude Bragdon, Ann Davies, Mabel Collins, Marie Corelli, stage magician named Claude Alexander Conlon, and my favorite potential authors of the Kybalion were Hermes himself, Count Cagliostro, and Swami Vivekananda. One of the confusing points on the authorship of the Kybalion is the Yogi Publication Society played with the publication date. And so that added further confusion and allowed many people to be thought of as possible authors. Even the address of the Yogi Publication Society itself created confusion. This is what you'll see on the original edition of the Kybalion. And many people took this to mean that the Kybalion was either written by a group of yogis or a group of Freemasons. But in fact, the Masonic temple in Chicago was a skyscraper. Freemasons built this building, but in order to finance the construction and the upkeep, while the first several floors were in fact a Masonic temple, the rest of the floors were simply rented office space. And many metaphysical groups and publishers like to have an office in Masonic temple, not just because it was cheap and convenient, but because of the cachet that the address itself lent to them. And I love this photograph so much. This is a high-resolution photograph of windows in the Masonic temple building. And I think you can see various professors, pseudo-professors and fortune tellers advertising their wares from the window. That was in Chicago, Illinois, and for at least a decade, the Masonic Temple was the tallest building in the city of Chicago. And newspapers took notice of the many different groups that were in the Masonic Temple building, and this is an article from the Chicago Tribune that saw it as a home and a symbol for all of the freak religions from all over the world that found their home in Chicago. So how do we prove that William Walker Atkinson was the author of the Kybalion? We talked about the just general difficulty of a book having 3 authors. I would suggest many things to put Atkinson forward as the sole author, and we can move from more general pieces of evidence to more specific and clear pieces of evidence. One is Atkinson's consistent use of sets of universal laws. This is not just an idea that he puts forth in the Kybalion, but it's an idea that he puts forth time and again in various works and is clearly trying to refine and modify and adapt over the years. So unlike other authors, he is obsessed, as an ex-lawyer would be, with various laws. And this goes all the way to his second to last manuscript, which was the 7 Cosmic Laws. There are also very similar references and quirks of writing style that we can find between the Kybalion and William Walker Atkinson's other writings that we do not see with the writings of any other authors. One of the big revelations I had when researching the Kybalion was the story of Theodore Kaczynski, a man in the United States who was known as the Unabomber. He sent out a series of mail bombs, and he insisted that the government print a manifesto that he wrote. And they published the manifesto because they hoped that someone would recognize him through his writing. And this is, in fact, what his own brother did. His own brother realized that his brother mangled the phrase "to have one's cake and eat it too," which was also done in the manifesto. So he was able to know who the author was through that quirk of language. I would not otherwise equate William Walker Atkinson with the Unabomber, but we can see this similar idea in play. Atkinson uses very particular turns of phrase in his writing that no one else does, and these turns of phrase show up in the Kybalion. One example that pops up in my head first is the phrase "meat for men, milk for babes," which he uses in the Kybalion and he uses in other writings. I think more conclusive are very direct pieces of evidence. Atkinson, on one hand, did not want to create a school of teachings. He did not want to create a cult of personality or a rigid set of doctrines around his teachings. In many different places, he said that he wanted readers to take what they could or wanted from his teachings, apply them to their own lives, and then just walk away. He didn't want any kind of debt or homage. But he was also in other places wanting simple recognition for the work that he did. In his personal copies of his books that were written under pseudonyms, he would put this inscription: "I wrote this book, WWA." He also wrote entries to biographical dictionaries known as Who's Who in America. There were local versions like Who's Who in Chicago, Who's Who in Los Angeles. And from these entries that Atkinson himself wrote, he himself claims to be the author of the Kybalion. In the first foreign language translation of the Kybalion, the editor of the French edition describes the author of the Kybalion as being the psychic master, William Walker Atkinson. So I think there are many reasons for us to believe that Atkinson was the sole author of the Kybalion. So what kind of life does the Kybalion take on after its publication? It takes on a remarkable global spread, and I think there are many reasons for this. I think the most kind of basic and practical reasons for this are that the Kybalion is simply balanced and it's accessible. At the same time, it also has an allure of mystery and intrigue, particularly with the mysteries surrounding its authorship. It's practical. It's also flexible. People from different traditions with different needs in their lives can come to the Kybalion and take lessons that they can apply to their lives. It's also very easily divisible into a series of lessons. It's organized in a very clear way. And I also think that it offered a myth to readers that was not just empowering, but it helped people to apply those teachings to their lives. It didn't just simply offer teachings to readers, but it emphasized to them that if they had discovered that book, that perhaps there was something significant about that. Perhaps they were ready to receive the teachings in the book that they had just encountered. There were also practical reasons for the spread of the Kybalion. The Yogi Publication Society was very adept at organizing itself and having its work sold around the world. So it had kind of trades with publishers around the world. It was also translated into numerous languages, often very rapidly. So at this point right now, the Kybalion has been translated into Braille, Chinese, Czech, Danish, Dutch, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, and Turkish. And this is Spanish translation of The Life of Hermes, which uses both lore about Hermes and the Kybalion combined into the book. So very early on, the Kybalion is used for business and salesmanship. There are numerous examples throughout the country in the 20s, 30s, and 40s of people using the Kybalion to enhance their salesmanship. It is also, I would argue, responsible for the 1960s counterculture. A major fan of the Kybalion was this man, Owsley Stanley. Owsley did two things to kind of kick off the Summer of Love in America. He invented a particularly potent form of LSD, and he was the sound engineer for the Grateful Dead. And so many things came out of these two accomplishments of Stanley, and the philosophical background for Stanley, as he told in an interview to Rolling Stone, was the Kybalion. He said the Kybalion, quote, was perfect because it put into total context all of the things I had experienced on acid. The universe is a creation entirely within a being that is outside time and space and dreaming what we are. Everything is connected because it's all being created by this one consciousness. And we are tiny reflections of the mind that is creating the universe. The Kybalion also becomes the core teaching for a new religious movement in Los Angeles in the early 1970s, known as the Source Family. They take the 7 Hermetic laws as kind of the core of their teachings, and the Source Family is responsible for, at the time, one of the most successful restaurants in the city and in the country, and was very much one of the main popularizers of vegetarian cuisine at their time. Other people took the African origins of Hermes Trismegistus and took on the Kybalion as a core philosophical text for Afrocentrist movements. So this is the poet Leroy Jones, who talks about Hermes Trismegistus, and there are other examples of African-American thinkers and writers using the teachings of the Kybalion in everything from painting and fine art to ideas about psychotherapy and family therapy. One of the biggest admirers of the Kybalion was television's George Jefferson, Sherman Hemsley. So in a piece about Hemsley for the magazine TV Guide, there's this fascinating glimpse. Hemsley grew up in the Pentecostal church, but according to his own account, left at the age of 9, eventually finding his way into a serious practice of meditation and mysticism. He was coy about what the catalyst for this transformation was, referring only to, quote, the man with the book. a kindly stranger he met that gave him a powerful text. Unlike Sherman Hemsley, his business partner, Andre Pavin, was more direct when he described Hemsley passing that same book on to him. Quote, "He gave me that book and others. The Kybalion. It changed my life," he told me. "You got to read it, man." And this is a very common story that we see time and again of the Kybalion being a book that is suggested from one person to another, recommended from one person to another. And I think there's a very fantastic irony in this, that Atkinson, in creating a backstory and a myth for the Kybalion, says it's a set of teachings that were passed from mouth to ear and mouth to ear, from student to teacher. And this ends up being exactly what happens. There's this rich history of the Kybalion being passed from mouth to ear, from one person to another, the suggestion of from one teacher to a student. The Kybalion is also picked up in the resurgence of witchcraft and things like Wicca. This is the self-described official witch of Salem, Massachusetts, Laurie Cabot, who said that the basis for witchcraft was the 7 Hermetic laws found in the Kybalion. And in numerous writings, pagan groups and Wiccan groups, they make a similar move, in that they say that the basis of magic is the 7 Hermetic laws of the Kybalion. I think perhaps the most significant role that the Kybalion played was through this man, Norman Vincent Peale, who is the author of a book called The Power of Positive Thinking, which was a remarkable bestseller. So after Peale's death, 2 Lutheran ministers, John Tweed and George Exu, they wrote an article where they discovered that beyond what Peale claimed his influences were for his own writings, he was in fact strongly influenced by Florence Scovel Shinn. And Shinn, in her own writings, gives a very deep nod of appreciation to the influence that the Kybalion had on her work. So as Tweed and Exu argue, the power of positive thinking, the modern prosperity gospel in America, is very much traced back through Peale, through Shinn, to the writings within the Kybalion. We also see the Kybalion again in a resurgence of ideas of the law of attraction and prosperity thinking. Doreen Virtue essentially does a reworked edition of the Kybalion that she calls Divine Magic. And in The Breakthrough Sensation, The Secret, it's very hard not to see the ideas of the Kybalion unnamed yet out in the open throughout much of its work. The Kybalion also makes an appearance in the Supreme Court of the United States through a group called Summum. So Summum is a very Egyptian-centered new religious movement that was inspired by the Kybalion. And as an amazing aside, there were at least 3 groups in the United States I found that have built pyramids based on what they believe were the core teachings of the Kybalion and its connections to Egypt. So one of these men, Claude Noel, was the founder of the group Summum. He claimed to have been visited by extraterrestrials in the mid-1970s. He changed his name to Corky Ra, and the group that he founded he named Summum. The core teachings of Summum were 7 laws that were identical to those in the Kybalion. In fact, when Noel tried to copyright his writings, they were rejected by the Copyright Office for being what they described as, quote, a derivative work. The group Summum wanted to place in a public park alongside an already existing monument to the 10 Commandments their own 7 laws of Summum, their own 7 aphorisms. And this was a case that spoke to a very significant gray area as far as public displays of religion in America went. So the Supreme Court decided to hear the case. So almost 100 years after the publication of the Kybalion, perhaps the best known, most influential writings of former attorney William Walker Atkinson were presented in the highest court in the United States, even though that they were never mentioned by name as his works. And here they are side by side. So, in conclusion, what can we say about the Kybalion? I think what is perhaps most remarkable about the Kybalion is that William Walker Atkinson was able to take so many teachings that he found powerful and useful in his own life, synthesize them in such an accessible and powerful way that they not only influenced a wide range of people, but that they still continue to be read and they still continue to have importance in people's lives today. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Yes, Buddy?
You didn't say why are these attributed to Hermes, Trismegistus?
I'm not sure why he attributes them to Hermes. We know that he's getting as above, so below from Hermetic texts. It's not clear how deeply he is engaging with actual Hermetic texts. It was very common for different occultists during this time to claim that they were some kind of Hermetic order, or that their teachings were based on Hermetic teachings. I think that the Hermetic aspect is mostly a frame for Atkinson to put the best pieces of wisdom that he encountered in his life into. I'm not sure why he picked Hermes specifically. It seems that in the introductory material to the Kybalion, he is not only trying to make them Hermetic, but he's also trying to make them not Hermetic. He's saying that they're Hermetic, but they're also universal teachings, and he places them, these are the core teachings of everything. We can see them in India, we can see them in the Mideast, we can see them all over the world. So in some ways, even though he's explicitly claiming them as Hermetic teachings, he's also kind of keeping them at a remove from Hermes, if that makes sense.
So it could be just a way to accept for the public, or for those who are in this kind of field, to accept the teachings because they are attributed to somebody who is kind of ancient.
Yeah, I often see the Kybalion as having these two different parts. You have these kind of core teachings, these aphorisms, and the aphorisms are explained. They're often explained in very practical ways, like the law of rhythm, the law of opposites that he describes and gives examples of. These are done in a very practical way. How to change thoughts of anger into thoughts of love. But then there's this other part of the Kybalion, kind of the framing of it, where at some points he says that the Kybalion was an ancient kind of written text, and then he says it was also an oral tradition. I don't know. I think he was trying to create some sort of frame for the Kybalion that could showcase the importance and the significance that he felt those teachings had in a way that couldn't be done if he simply said, these are really significant and you should listen.
Yeah, to connect with the question of Fred here. At the time, there was a tremendous input into the Hermetic and Hermetic philosophy and magic. Practical examples are the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which is behind the formation of the TS, and other organizations too. So perhaps he must have, kind of ridden the wave, so to speak, to make it. But yes, Hermetics, that is also, there's a lot to say. It's very ancient, and it's not just this gentleman who standard, the 7 principles.
Yeah, I think his writings as Yogi Ramacharaka are an interesting example, because some people like to criticize the Yogi Ramacharaka books as saying they're not authentic. This is not what yogis in India did. But it wasn't really the point. He wanted to create an ideal figure, an ideal type that had the best, what he saw as the best attributes. So in his writings, he says, you know, yogis are very industrious and active. Of course they're not. Of course they're not. You know, with the exception of Baba Ramdev right now, we're not seeing yogis heading major corporations and, you know, working 16-hour days. I don't think the point for him was having some sort of authentic representation, but rather a frame for the best things that he learned. I think the magazine writings that Atkinson did are very instructive because we kind of get a deeper layer of him. It's as close, I think, as we can get to like diary entries. It's kind of month by month his view of the world. And he never seems to have taught anything that he didn't believe in or practiced. So it's not clear. While, you know, he was aware of this kind of Hermetic current in all these different groups, at the same time, he kind of very consciously kept himself at a remove from many of these groups.
Not only that, but perhaps it is important to always bear in mind the two currents. There is always an exoteric, so a path which is, you know, open to anybody, and then there is the exoteric. So, you know, just speculation, or perhaps he was a member of some occult brotherhood.
Yeah.
You know, nobody knows about that. So you have to be, you know, a bit, you know, wary and sort of, you know, presented under whichever banner, as long as, you know, he wanted to, you know, obviously the fusion of these teachings was paramount for him. I guess.
Yeah, there's, from what I've seen in Atkinson's writings, he was very much a democratic esotericist. I think if there were levels, that he believed that there could be layers to teachings and that people could have different and deeper understandings of the same teaching. But he was democratic in the sense that, unlike many of his peers, he never charged for direct instruction. He published books. He published books that were out there in the world and they were accessible and anyone could pick up. And unlike giving a little taste in a book but then having teachings that were secret, he wanted to give exercises and practical examples in his book to everyone. I think that's what's so powerful about the Yogi Ramacharaka books, why they were so influential, was he didn't just want to philosophize, he wanted to give exercises. Do this and do that. You can do this in 5 minutes. You can do this in 10 minutes. Yes?
Well, one of the things that I found remarkable when I first read it was how unremarkable a book it was.
Uh-huh.
It's a thin book. It's very succinct. It's very readable. It's very easy to read. But you know, it contains nothing that I don't understand as being the basics of all magical thought anyway. Now, I don't know how much of that is me looking from a late 20th century perspective back to sort of somebody 100 years before. But a lot of the stuff in it I recognise anyway from Greek thought, from Hermetic thought, from alchemical thought. And yet it has been hugely influential. You know, Hermetic students still refer to it with awe, whereas the man himself wasn't a Hermetic student. He was a general student, a Theosophical stroke yogic student, that sort of thing. It just puzzles me. I mean, I've got 2 copies at home, so you know, I'm not running it down. But it's to what extent do you think that he offered original magical thought, or was it just a codification of everything that had been around in the world up to that time?
I want to answer carefully. I think in some ways his genius was as a synthesizer, as someone who was exposed to a lot and could kind of filter it through and give very succinct, efficient explanations of what teachings were. But I think he was more than just a synthesizer, of what was out there. He seems to have been someone who very much practiced what he preached. I'm going to very quickly rush back to Herbert Parkin. I think it's much more than just synthesis. He saw many of these techniques in his own life and in other people's lives have dramatic, concrete results and effects. And he himself, in his magazine writings, talks about himself as being a mental scientist, of constantly trying to test out and see examples for these ideas of the mind and how they worked or did not work in the everyday world. I think that's one of the fascinating things about the magazine articles, is that he is always looking out into the world to see how these ideas play out in people's lives in a practical.
Interesting in view of your talk, giving his biography, his where the world was when the book was written. So sort of, it's only an afternoon's reading. It'd be interesting just to sort of have a gallop through the book again in light of your talk.
Yeah. He mentions, I don't know if it's in the Kybalion, it's in other books, I think, where he talks about reading a book of his and then coming back to it a few weeks, a few months, a few years later. And so I think a lot of it was designed for that. It's simple. It's not necessarily hidden wisdom, but if you take the laws of the Kybalion and you come back to them 5 years later, you'll understand them in a very different way. Yes?
What's the etymology of the word Kybalion?
It's not clear. In my own recent galloping through the Kybalion, there's a part in the beginning where he says there's nothing known about the origins of this word Kybalion. So there are no hints within the Kybalion itself, and there are no hints outside of the Kybalion. It's often confused with Kabbalah. I don't know if that's intentional or not. I've speculated that perhaps it's a playing on the word alchemy, Kybalion, something like that. There's all these statements throughout the Kybalion that, like, true alchemy is mental alchemy. If you're able to transmute mental states, you're the true alchemist. I'm not sure. Or if it just sounded good. Yes?
When you talk about all of the offshoots of the Kybalion and these different sects and religions that have sprung up, and I think you mentioned before the talk that the Freemasons kind of looked at the book and said, this is for us and that kind of thing. If you look at the first law of mentalism, this is a very, very powerful thing, because obviously it teaches you how to transmute and control your own thoughts and actions, but it also teaches you how to influence other people's minds. So anyone with a need for power would quickly grab on this. And I can understand that could have an influence. But if you look at some of the other laws, some of the other six, I don't know that a lot of them, obviously, the correspondence was a very ancient one, but do you think that he got a lot of these from the secret doctrine? Because these are all mentioned in the secret doctrine.
Oh, I would not doubt that at all.
So actually, we could say the Kabbalah, if we accept that there was nothing anciently or nothing much anciently except what Blavatsky brought through, the Kybalion is partially a result of the secret doctrine, not the other way around.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to dismiss any. I don't know if it's possible to dismiss any claims to the influence of Theosophy on Atkinson. It's difficult to say for certain. Unfortunately, we do not have diary entries from Atkinson. We don't really have many letters back and forth. I mean, there are like 6 or 7 letters. We have the magazines where he's writing a lot, he's answering questions. There's no kind of silver bullet that shows us exactly what he was thinking when he was writing. from the evidence that I've seen, when you trace back the sources of his writings, clearly he was enamored with Theosophy. Clearly he was immersed in Theosophical writings. He was, proficient in his understanding of Theosophy. I mean, there's no proof of it, but I think he probably had in the back of his mind that the best ideas that he encountered, the most useful teachings that he encountered, he wanted to pass those along to other people.
And I have one more question. You mentioned Norman Vincent Peale.
Uh-huh.
I believe he was Freemason.
Mm-hmm.
And what about people like Napoleon Hill and Wallace Wattles and that? They wrote the same kind of thing, approximately in the same time period.
Yeah.
About things that have recently come out in The Secret and Law of Attraction. All that was being written about at this same time, wasn't it?
It was. Napoleon Hill is, 1929. In one of his last books, his famous book is Think and Grow Rich. One of his last books is Grow Rich with Peace of Mind. And what's really fascinating about that is Napoleon Hill early on this is just practical teachings. I'm just talking to businessmen and industrialists, and this is a secret. This is how good business is done. In Grow Rich with Peace of Mind, he goes way out of field, and he talks about being visited by 32 secret masters, and he really goes out there, which suggests to me, when you get into the history of self-help literature in the United States, the people who author successful self-help and positive thinking books are extraordinarily well-versed in what came before them. A few authors will admit it and say, I read everything from Ben Franklin to last year's bestseller, but it's a safe assumption that anyone who's writing those kind of books at that kind of level is aware of what came before them. Often it's very difficult to trace the threads back.
Right. And one last thing. A lot of the Rosicrucian teachings on the same area are just the same, but they claim also more ancient origins. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's also tough to know if you're getting kind of tertiary influences of if people like Atkinson are writing texts that influence someone else, and then if people are picking up those influences without knowing what the original source was.
Except the Secret Doctrine was written before this.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think Atkinson also had again, he was a democratic esotericist. He saw that there was a lot of sympathy and harmonization with different teachings. And at one level, in the same way that he didn't care too much about attribution to himself, even though he understood many things in very specific ways, at the end of the day, he was very kind of open. And he could look at different things like New Thought, suggestive therapeutics, and very much synthesize them and harmonize them with teachings like Theosophy and everything else. In his magazine writings, he does that a lot. When people write in with questions about faith healing and spiritualism, he's always trying to not dismiss things before he can possibly explain them in terms of other things.
There was a religion, I think, about Christian Science down at American area, religious lady in New England. Did he have any link with that? Or
With Christian Science?
Yeah.
Christian Science is fairly well connected to New Thought. I think Atkinson appreciated some of the doctrines of Christian Science, but he really chafed under organizational rigidity. So Mary Baker Eddy early on expelled several students that she felt were misrepresenting her teachings and were kind of too charismatic and influential on their own. These teachers ended up going to Chicago. Emma Curtis Hopkins was the most famous of them. And so from Christian Science, these kind of banished students, they start teaching their own techniques that are branching away from Christian Science, and that's where the positive thinking New Thought movement spreads. So Emma Curtis Hopkins, a student of Mary Baker Eddy, she goes to Chicago, and you can basically trace all of these big New Thought organizations, Divine Science, Mental Science, Unity School of Christianity. They all have this one woman as their source.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just a small one. You mentioned, you referred earlier to the title of the book, and it's made to sound a bit like Kabbalah, and it's made to sound a bit like it's a Greek word, but it's just a made-up word, isn't it?
As far as I can tell, yes. I mean, as I said in the introduction, he says that there is no known use of the word Kybalion. We don't know where the word comes from.
Because he had made it up.
He made it up, and I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's a play on alchemy. I don't know if it's a play on Kabbalah. I don't know if it just sounded right.
No, as far as I know, it exists nowhere else.
Yeah.
It's a good word, though.
Yeah. We're talking about it today. Yes.
I have two questions and one observation, if I may please. My first question is, how was it received initially? Did those who read it think it was an ancient text, or did they know it was a modern text?
Again, that's hard to tell. I think many of the groups who take it on believe it to be ancient. And it's hard to tell because some groups take the entire Kybalion as being ancient, which when you read the text, there are all sorts of modern references. So, I think there's a reference to the philosopher Herbert Spencer in there. And so, clearly the ancient Hermetic figures are not going to be referencing Herbert Spencer unless they're able to travel through time. So some groups do take it on as ancient. Whether it's just the core teachings and the maxims are ancient or the whole thing is ancient is different. But it's hard to tell.
My observation is about magazine editors and writers and how many were either TS members or influenced by the TS members. There were many of them. But my last question is about the Masonic Temple, because I found that quite interesting, and I wondered whether you know whether the skyscraper was designed by Louis Sullivan.
I don't know.
The reason I ask is because Louis Sullivan, who designed many of the Chicago skyscrapers around that time, and it looks to me very much like the Sullivan skyscraper, himself was involved with mystic texts.
Huh.
So that might be something perhaps to look into, because his designs were based on sacred architecture coming from mystic texts.
Wow. Yeah, I think Atkinson, there's a lot there. I think Atkinson was one of many people during this time who read Theosophical texts, but were not card-carrying members and often kept that affiliation a secret. Atkinson, I think, was neither someone who would go out of his way, but would also not go out of his way to hide his admiration for Theosophy. He makes references to Blavatsky. So he makes open references. He also makes veiled references, quotations that he's taking from Theosophical magazines that he's not directly saying as this Theosophical publication says. But many of his peers are very similar in that regards. When you poke into their writings, it's clear that they're reading Theosophical magazines, they're reading Theosophical texts. They're not presenting themselves as doing so, though. Yes?
Sorry. I was just wondering, I read somewhere recently that all the books of Yogi Ramacharaka were written by two Theosophists. I don't know if you have come across that. In concrete, I think it's 14 lessons, the advanced course, advanced course. I just came across, and the editorial wanted them to continue writing under the pseudonym of Yogi Ramacharaka, and they weren't keen. And so somebody else continued with that. I was wondering whether you came across that information.
As far as I know, and kind of like the Kybalion, all evidence points to Yogi Ramacharaka being the pseudonym of William Walker Atkinson. There are multiple records of that. Towards the end of his life in Los Angeles, he gives lectures, and in parentheses underneath his name, it's Yogi Ramacharaka. A woman named Elizabeth Town, who was a New Thought publisher, she kind of couldn't keep a secret, and she says, you know, I know who Yogi Ramacharaka is. He's one of the American New Thought authors, and I think he describes better yogi teachings than the yogis in India. But I can see why people would think that Yogi Ramacharaka could be the product of two Theosophists, because of Atkinson's background, you're getting so many theosophical terms and ideas that are being put into his text. So I think I can see that logic that's there.
Can I have one
Yeah,
final?
absolutely.
The Hermetica.
Uh-huh.
What do you know to be the earliest date of publication of the Hermetica?
I don't know specifically. I do remember from doing the research of the Kybalion that certainly within the 19th century, people, Atkinson's predecessors, were reading copies of the Hermetica and writing about Hermetic teachings. So Atkinson is certainly not the first to do so. Those ideas were very much in circulation.
And they were accepted at the time to be ancient teachings?
Yeah, it's hard to tell.
Again, you don't know.
It's hard to tell because Atkinson he's not presenting the Hermetica as Hermetic teachings.
Right.
He's presenting a lot of these other schools of thought that he's immersed with, and he's presenting them as Hermetic. So whether he is poring over the Hermetica, I don't know. There's no indication that he's putting a lot of that material in the Kybalion.
Thank you. It's given us all a lot of food for thought. So, can we just show our appreciation to Phillip?
Thank you.